My name is Elena Walsh. I was 16 years old when my mother told me I would start paying rent, $600 a month. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She said it the same way someone announces a rule that has already been decided. "You live here," she said. "It's time you contribute." I stared at her, trying to understand whether she was serious. "I'm 16, I said. She nodded. "That's old enough." There was no discussion, no warning. Just a number placed between us like a boundary line. "Before we begin the story, I'd like you to tell me where you're listening, what time it is, and your personal opinion about this story." I looked past her toward the living room. My brother Ryan was there, 19 years old, stretched across the couch, laughing into his headset while playing video games. He hadn't worked since graduating high school. He hadn't been asked to. "So does Ryan pay rent too?" I asked. My mother answered without even turning her head. "No." The word landed heavier than the number. "Why not?" I asked. She folded her arms. "Girls mature faster. You're responsible. This will prepare you for life." That sentence would follow me for years, not because it made sense, but because it was used to justify everything unfair. I got a job 2 weeks later. Actually, 2 jobs. After school, I waited tables at a diner. On weekends, I worked at a grocery store. I learned how to count tips fast, how to smile through exhaustion, how to pretend I wasn't falling behind in class. Every first of the month, I handed my mother $600. She never thanked me. If I was late, she reminded me. If I struggled, she told me that was the point. "This is how the real world works," she said. But the real world didn't look like our house. In the real world, adults paid bills. In our house, the only person paying rent was a teenage girl still legally required to attend school. Ryan slept until noon. When I came home late, he would ask, "How much did you make today?" Not out of concern, out of curiosity. Once, he laughed and said, "Guess Mom knows who's actually capable." I didn't laugh back, because I was starting to realize something uncomfortable. This wasn't about responsibility. It was about who she could demand from without resistance. My mother liked to talk about my rent in front of other people. At family gatherings, she would say, "Elena pays rent already. She's learning independence." Relatives smiled. Some even praised her. "That's good parenting," they said. No one asked about Ryan. No one asked why the responsibility only moved in one direction. I learned quickly that suffering looks respectable when it's quiet. If you don't complain, people call you strong. If you don't resist, they call it maturity. So I stopped talking. But I didn't stop watching. The first time I almost failed a class, my mother didn't ask about my workload. She asked, "Are you managing your money properly?" The first time I skipped dinner because I was short on cash, she said, "Budget better?" When I finally asked if the rent would ever stop, she looked offended. "You should be grateful," she said. "I'm making you capable." Capable, that word sounded suspiciously like useful. So I did the only thing I could. I complied, and quietly, without telling her, I started keeping records. Every payment, every date, every amount. Not because I planned revenge, but because somewhere deep down, I understood something my 16-year-old mind couldn't fully name yet. This wasn't normal. And one day, I would need proof. Paying rent didn't make me feel grown. It made me feel replaceable. Once the money started coming in regularly, my role in the house shifted without anyone announcing it. I wasn't just her daughter anymore. I was someone who contributed, someone whose presence had a price attached. And once something has a price, it stops being protected. My mother began treating my schedule like it was flexible by default. If she needed errands done, she expected me to adjust my work hours. If Ryan wanted the car, I was told to figure it out. After all, I was the one learning responsibility. The irony never crossed her mind. I was balancing school, 2 jobs, and a monthly bill. Ryan was balancing sleep schedules and game releases, and somehow, I was the one being prepared for life. The rules were clear, but only for me. If I came home late from work, she asked why I couldn't manage my time better. If Ryan came home late, she asked if he was hungry. If I forgot to do a chore, she reminded me I was living here by agreement. If Ryan forgot, she laughed and said boys were messy. Every dollar I earned was accounted for. None of his absence was questioned. One night, after a double shift, I asked her directly, "When will Ryan start contributing?" She didn't hesitate. "When he's ready." I waited for more. "When will that be?" I asked. She looked at me like I was missing something obvious. "You're better at handling pressure. He's sensitive." Sensitive. That was the word she used to excuse him. Mature was the word she used to burden me. The pressure started showing. My grades slipped. I stopped raising my hand in class because I was always tired. Friends stopped inviting me out because I always said no. I didn't have money for movies, food, or gas, unless it served work. Home stopped feeling like a place I returned to. It felt like somewhere I rented space between shifts. The worst part wasn't exhaustion. It was realizing that if I collapsed, nothing would stop. The rent wouldn't pause. The expectations wouldn't soften. And no one would catch me because I wasn't being raised. I was being used. The first time I tried to talk about it, my mother shut it down immediately. "I don't understand why you're complaining," she said. "You're capable. You're strong." I asked, "Do you think this is fair?" She replied, "Life isn't fair. I'm preparing you." That sentence ended every conversation. It was impossible to argue with a philosophy that treated harm as education. So I stopped trying to convince her. Instead, I started observing patterns. She relied on my money, not casually, structurally. The rent paid part of the utilities, sometimes groceries, sometimes repairs. When I once suggested lowering it during finals week, she snapped, "I budget around that money." That was when it clicked. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a lesson. This was dependence, disguised as discipline. Ryan noticed it too, just not in the same way. One afternoon, he joked, "Guess you're basically mom's roommate now." The word stayed with me, roommate. Except roommates have contracts. Roommates have boundaries. Roommates aren't minors. And roommates can leave. That last part became important. I started saving more than receipts. I saved screenshots of messages reminding me to pay. I saved bank statements showing regular transfers. I saved texts where she referred to the money as rent. I didn't confront her. I didn't threaten anything. I learned to stay quiet when something felt wrong, because quiet people aren't challenged, and I wasn't ready to be challenged yet. I was still 16, still trapped, still paying to belong in a house that treated me like an asset. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't asking why me anymore. I was asking how long, and more importantly, what would happen when I stopped? By the time I turned 17, the rent wasn't a surprise anymore. It was routine. The first of the month meant an envelope. $600 meant permission to exist in my own house. What I didn't expect was the night my mother decided to turn it into a performance. It was my aunt's birthday dinner. Extended family packed into the dining room. Plates passed around. Everyone talking over each other. I came straight from work, still tired, still smelling faintly of fryer oil. I sat down quietly, hoping to disappear into the background like I usually did. That didn't happen. My mother raised her glass halfway through dinner. "I just want to say," she began, smiling proudly, "that I'm really proud of Elena." Heads turned toward me. I froze. "She's been paying rent since she was 16. My mother continued, "I believe in teaching independence early. Too many kids these days are entitled." People nodded. Some smiled at me approvingly. "That's impressive," someone said. "You raised her right." Another added. Applause followed. Actual applause. I sat there with my hands in my lap, my face burning, realizing something twisted and heavy all at once. They weren't applauding my strength. They were applauding my compliance. No one asked whether I had chosen this. No one asked why I needed to pay rent while still in high school. No one asked about my brother, because my brother was right there. Ryan leaned back in his chair, grinning, enjoying the attention indirectly. When someone joked, "Guess you'll be paying rent too soon," he laughed and said, "Nah, Mom knows I'd never survive that." Everyone laughed. My mother laughed with them. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was accidental. After dinner, while people were clearing plates, I asked my mother quietly, "Why would you tell everyone that?" She looked confused. "Why not? It shows how capable you are." "It's embarrassing," I said. "It makes it sound like I'm lucky." She frowned. "You are lucky. That word again. Lucky to work 2 jobs. Lucky to pay rent as a minor. Lucky to be praised instead of protected. You don't complain," she continued. "That's why this works." That sentence stayed with me. That's why this works. Not because it was right, because I endured it. That night, I lay awake doing math in my head. Not just money, time. I calculated how many hours I worked each week, how much went to rent, how little was left for myself, how much of my life was being spent just to maintain approval. Then I calculated something else, how dependent my mother had become on my money. The realization was unsettling. If I stopped paying, the budget would break. Utilities would be late. Groceries would shrink. She needed the rent now, and suddenly, the power dynamic wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. I didn't act on it. Not yet. I stayed quiet for another year. I paid on time. I smiled when relatives praised me. I let my mother continue calling it a lesson instead of what it was. But I also prepared. I opened my own bank account the day I legally could. I stopped handing her cash and started transferring money digitally. I labeled every payment clearly. Rent, June. Rent, July. Rent, August. Not hidden, not vague. Documented. Ryan noticed the shift. "You planning something?" he asked one night. I shrugged. "Just being responsible." He laughed and went back to his game. He didn't realize he was standing on ground that wasn't his. By the time my 18th birthday approached, I had a plan. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise. I would leave quietly. I would stop paying, and I would let the truth do the talking. Because one thing had become very clear to me. My mother loved the story of my maturity. She just didn't expect the ending to include my absence. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't threaten her. I didn't warn her. I simply turned 18, finished high school, and left. No argument marked the moment. No dramatic goodbye. I packed my clothes, my documents, and the folder I had been building for 2 years. I moved into a small shared apartment closer to my job and school. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. The first of the month arrived 3 days later. At 8:12 a.m., my phone rang. "Where's the rent?" my mother asked, skipping any greeting. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. "I don't live there anymore." There was a pause. Brief, sharp. "What do you mean you don't live here?" she said. I moved out. Another pause. Longer this time. "You can't just leave," she said. "I budget around that money." There it was. The sentence that confirmed everything I had suspected. Not, "I'll miss you." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Why didn't you tell me?" Just the money. "I'm 18, I said calmly. "I'm not paying rent anymore." Her voice changed immediately. "So after everything I did for you, you abandon your family?" she snapped. I didn't raise my voice. "I paid rent as a minor. For 2 years. That was to teach you responsibility," she said. "You should be grateful, for paying to be allowed inside a house where I was never prioritized." By noon, the messages started. "You're being selfish. You think you're better than us now? Ryan needs support too. Family doesn't just walk away." I didn't respond, because for the first time, I didn't need to explain myself to survive. That night, she called again. "This is hurting the household," she said. "Utilities are due. Groceries are tight." I asked the question I had avoided for years. Why doesn't Ryan help? She scoffed. You know he's not like you. I know, I replied. That's the problem. She accused me of being cold, of forgetting my place, of turning my back on family values. I didn't argue. I just said, I won't be sending money anymore. Then I hung up. The fallout was immediate. Relatives called. Some asked gently. Others accused openly. Your mother says you've become ungrateful. My aunt said. She relied on you. Another relative added. You knew how much she needed that money. Not one of them asked why she needed rent from a child. Not one of them asked why an adult son paid nothing. I realized something then. The story had already been written for them. And it didn't include my side, so I stopped trying to add footnotes. Ryan texted me a week later. Mom's stressed. She says you ruined everything. I replied with one line. I paid rent from 16 to 18. You paid 0. There was no response. 2 weeks later, my mother asked to meet. Just to talk, she said. We met at a small cafe near her house. She arrived tense, already defensive. You embarrassed me, she said before sitting down. People are asking questions. I nodded. Good. Her eyes widened. You think this is funny? No, I said. I think it's honest. She leaned forward. You owe me. You lived under my roof. I opened my folder and slid it across the table. Every payment, every month, every transfer labeled clearly as rent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I let the evidence speak. She stared at the pages, her mouth tightening. You didn't have to keep this, she said quietly. I did, I replied, because I knew one day you'd say I imagined it. She looked up at me then, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't look like the authority in the room. She looked like someone realizing a system had just collapsed. I stood up. I'm not asking for the money back, I said. I'm just done paying for a role I never chose. She didn't stop me when I walked away. She didn't apologize either. But something had changed. The rent was gone, and so was the control that came with it. After that cafe meeting, my mother went quiet. Not reflective quiet, strategic quiet. The calls stopped. The texts slowed. When relatives reached out, their tone changed. Less accusation, more confusion. That told me she was adjusting the story, editing it, trimming the parts that no longer served her. She wasn't denying the rent. She was reframing it. She offered to help. She told people she wanted responsibility. I never forced her. I didn't rush to correct anyone, because lies need energy to survive, and I had finally stopped supplying it. A month later, I learned how deeply my money had been woven into her life. Ryan called me, not to apologize, not to ask how I was. He asked, "Did you really stop paying completely?" "Yes," I said. He exhaled sharply. "She's freaking out." That was the first honest sentence I'd heard in years. He told me the power bill had been late, that groceries had become basic, that my mother had suggested Ryan start contributing, just temporarily, he said, until things stabilize. I almost laughed. That was the difference. When I paid rent, it was a lesson. When Ryan was asked to help, it was a crisis. He didn't last 2 weeks. He complained it was unfair, that he wasn't ready, that the pressure was affecting his mental health. My mother agreed. She stopped asking him. Instead, she called me again. "You don't understand what you've done," she said. "You pulled the rug out from under us." I answered calmly. I moved out. I stopped paying rent. That's normal. What's not normal is abandoning your family, she snapped. I took a breath. What's not normal is charging a minor rent while supporting an adult. Silence. She said quietly, "You didn't have to say it like that." "I did," I replied, "because pretending it was anything else is why it lasted." The final confrontation came at a family gathering I hadn't planned to attend. I only went because my grandmother asked me directly. "I want us all in one room," she said. "No stories, just truth." I knew what that meant. My mother arrived tense. Ryan avoided my eyes. Relatives sat cautiously. already aware that something had shifted. Someone asked the question out loud. Did Elena really pay rent at 16? My mother answered quickly. It wasn't rent. It was helping. I didn't interrupt. Then my grandmother turned to me. Elena, I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table. Receipts, transfers, dates, amounts. 2 full years. Clearly labeled, no emotion, no commentary, just facts. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, my aunt said, Ryan, did you ever pay? He shook his head. No, the imbalance stood there, undeniable. My mother tried one last time. She was mature. She could handle it. My grandmother replied quietly. Maturity isn't something you charge interest on. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, just decisive. After that night, the calls stopped for good. Not because she understood, but because the narrative no longer belonged to her. Relatives stopped praising her parenting. Some apologized to me privately. Others stayed silent, unsure where to stand. Ryan moved out 6 months later. He struggled. He blamed everyone but himself. I didn't step in. Not out of spite, out of boundaries. People ask me now if I regret leaving. I don't. What I regret is how long I believed endurance was the same as love. Paying rent didn't teach me responsibility. It taught me clarity. It taught me that being capable often means being exploited, unless you decide otherwise. And when I finally stopped paying for acceptance, something unexpected happened. I didn't lose a family. I gained my self-respect. Distance changes things. Once I was no longer paying rent, no longer filling budget gaps, no longer absorbing pressure quietly, my role in the family became unclear. I wasn't the reliable one anymore. I wasn't the example. I wasn't the solution they could lean on. I was just someone who had stepped out of the system, and systems don't forgive that easily. At first, my mother tried to reassert control in subtler ways. She sent messages that sounded concerned but carried an edge. Are you eating properly? You look tired lately. You know you can always come home. Home. The word felt strange coming from someone who had once attached a price to it. When I didn't respond the way she expected, the tone shifted. You've changed. You're colder now. I don't recognize you. I read those messages carefully and realized something important. She wasn't missing me. She was missing the version of me that complied. Without my money, her authority weakened. She couldn't claim moral high ground while asking relatives for help. She couldn't lecture about responsibility when Ryan still avoided work. The imbalance that had once been hidden behind my silence was now exposed. People began asking questions she couldn't answer. Why had a 16-year-old been paying rent? Why had that money been necessary? Why was the adult son exempt? My mother started avoiding gatherings. Not because she felt guilty, because guilt requires reflection. This was about discomfort. Ryan and I spoke once more, unexpectedly. He showed up at my apartment one evening, hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered. Not wiser, just worn. I didn't think it would be this hard, he admitted. I nodded. I didn't either. When I was 16, he frowned. That's not the same. I looked at him. It is. The difference is, no one caught me when I struggled. He didn't argue, because for the first time, there was nothing he could say that would tilt the truth back in his favor. He left shortly after. We haven't spoken since. The strangest part wasn't losing contact. It was realizing how much space opened up when I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. I slept better. I ate regularly. I studied without panic. I wasn't constantly calculating what I owed, financially or emotionally. Responsibility stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like choice. That distinction mattered more than I ever expected. Months later, my mother tried one last approach. She called and said, I think we both made mistakes. The word both hung between us. I waited. She continued. I pushed you because I believed in you. I replied calmly. You charged me because I didn't push back. Silence. I'm not angry anymore, I added. But I'm not coming back to that dynamic. She asked. So what now? I answered honestly. Now we have a relationship without money in it. Or we don't have one. She didn't respond. That was her answer. I used to believe maturity meant enduring more than others. I was wrong. Maturity is recognizing when endurance becomes erasure. I didn't leave because I hated my family. I left because I finally understood my role in it. And once you see the structure clearly, you can't pretend the wait is normal anymore. People still tell me I grew up fast. They say it like it's a compliment. I don't correct them, but I know the truth. I didn't grow up fast. I was pushed forward so someone else could stay comfortable. And when I stopped paying for that comfort, the entire illusion collapsed. That was the real lesson. Not responsibility, not independence, boundaries. The first year without rent felt unreal. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because for the first time, every struggle belonged to me, not to someone else's expectations. Every bill I paid was mine by choice. Every sacrifice had a purpose I understood. No one was calling it a lesson anymore. That alone felt like freedom. My mother and I stopped speaking regularly. At first, the silence felt heavy. I had been conditioned to believe that distance meant failure, that walking away meant I was ungrateful. But as months passed, I realized something unsettling. My life was calmer without her voice in it. No reminders, no guilt framed as concern, no praise that only came when I was useful. When we did speak, it was brief and neutral. She avoided the past. I didn't bring it up. The rent was never mentioned again, not because it was forgiven, but because it no longer had power. Ryan moved out eventually. He struggled more than he expected. Jobs didn't come easily. Bills felt overwhelming. The same pressure I'd carried at 16 hit him years later, without preparation, without discipline, without the illusion of choice. He reached out once, months after he left home. "I get it now," he said quietly. I believed him. But understanding doesn't undo damage. I wished him well. I didn't step back into the role I'd escaped. That, too, was growth. The story my family tells about me has softened over time. They say I was independent early. They say I chose my own path. They say my mother meant well. I let them say it, because the truth doesn't need to be repeated once it's been lived. I know what happened. I know what it cost. And I know what it gave me. Sometimes people ask if I'd do anything differently. I think about the nights I worked double shifts, the meals I skipped, the years I believed love was something you paid for. And the answer is no, because that experience taught me something I never would have learned otherwise. That adulthood isn't about suffering quietly. It's about deciding what you will no longer accept. My mother once told me, "Girls mature faster." She was right about one thing. I did mature faster, not because I was wiser, not because I was stronger, but because I was forced to see reality earlier than most. And when I finally stepped away, I didn't just stop paying rent. I stopped paying with my time, my energy, my silence. I stopped paying for a version of love that required me to disappear. Today, my life is simple. I pay for my own place. I manage my own money. I build relationships where care isn't transactional. No one applauds me for it. No one calls it impressive. And that's exactly how it should be. Because real independence isn't something you're charged for. It's something you claim. And once you do, no one can ever invoice you for existing again.